You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Israel's war on Gaza, which has cost the lives of over 30,000 Gazans since 7th of October 2023, and at this time of recording shows no signs of abating, the humanitarian costs will likely impact the region for decades. It is also worth mentioning here there's still over 130 Israeli hostages in Gaza, which also do not look like at this stage of getting out through Israel's current military action. But despite reports of disagreements between US President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Washington has backed Israel's actions all the way. Where does this leave US foreign policy in the Middle East? Joining me today is Chas Freeman. Chas Freeman is the author of 5 books and numerous articles on statecraft and the editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica article on diplomacy. He is the former US Assistant of Defense, Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the African Affairs, Chargé d'Affaires, Bangkok and Beijing, Acting US Commissioner for Refugee Affairs and Director of Program Coordination and Development of US Information Agency. He was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's 1972 opening of US relations with China. Chas Freeman, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I don't know how I survived all that introduction, but I'm very happy to be with you.
Well, you would be pleased to know your bio was one of the shortest I've ever received.
Good.
Despite it being a very long career, which is actually where we're going to start, we want to talk a little bit about you first. It was a very interesting read. It feels like you've been at the forefront, well, at least part of US history for the last 50, 60 years. You've seen a lot of it unfold and you've been part of it. I mean, if you can sort of start with, you were the principal interpreter to the Nixon administration during the opening with China. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about how you found yourself there and what that was like to be translating during that event?
Well, I attended the Harvard Law School, decided not to be a lawyer. Lawyers resemble oysters, you know. They have a free-swimming polyp phase, then they settle down on a rock and flap their mouths for a living and can't move again. And I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted to do it in a career that was mobile, that periodically resulted in a change of colleagues, of cultural environment, of linguistic demands, and intellectual demands. And I foresaw that we would have to open a relationship with China. This is when we had none. The global geopolitical geometry, I thought, required it. And I hoped to be there when this happened. So I joined the United States Foreign Service. I spent 30 years as a diplomat serving my country. And fortuitously, I did learn Chinese just at the right moment to appear in Beijing with the late President Nixon in what was truly an historic moment that shifted the global kaleidoscope quite substantially. And I have to say that that had some planning to it, but I was very fortunate thereafter to be involved in many issues which were of national or international importance.
You say a moment, you fortunately learnt it in the moment, but of course, learning Chinese, as we know, is a very complex language to learn. It would have taken you at least 5 to 6 years to get to a standard where you could translate it, I would imagine. So I feel like it's slightly longer than a moment.
Well, it was a bit longer than a moment, but I have learned and forgotten many languages. So I applied myself. I remember when I began to study Chinese, which was January 2nd, 1969, a great tall northern Chinese fellow came in, introduced himself, and said in English, "I'm going to speak to you in English today. This will be the last time you hear me do it." He said, "I just want to say one thing." He said, "Probably people have told you that Chinese is a very hard language to learn." He said, "Don't believe it. At this moment, there are 850 million people who speak it, and most of them are dumb as doorposts. And you're very smart or you wouldn't be here. So if you apply yourself, you will learn Chinese." 20 years later, I had a parallel experience with Arabic. I went into the language class. There was a little Yemeni guy there, and he said to me, "You're not going to speak to you in English just this once, because probably somebody's told you that Arabic is a very hard language to learn." And it's absolutely correct. No one's ever learned it properly. You won't be the exception. And even we Arabs can't speak it properly. And but they're paying me to teach you, so I will. Kul shay maktub. Anyway, very different attitudes, illustrating the diversity of the world, which is a joy to experience.
Yes, and when you were in China doing the translation, I mean, I imagine you had, many great stories to tell from that trip and that experience when you were actually there. What was the atmosphere like? What was it like to actually do that?
Well, I think people need to realize that usually summits between adversaries are divided into two parts. One is an encounter between the chiefs of state or government, and they talk about pleasant things they've seen and done and plan to do together. And then the other is the foreign ministers, who sit down and talk about all the things they don't agree about and that offend each other and so forth. So my principal interpreting job, other than at the table, dining table, which is, of course, an essential part of diplomacy, was with the Secretary of State and his counterpart, the acting foreign minister. It was the Cultural Revolution. There was nobody in an official position. And we talked about our differences in Korea, in Vietnam, in Kashmir, with regard to the Japanese role in Pacific Asia, and so forth and so on. It was very unpleasant and quite stressful. I actually had some arguments with the Chinese interpreters, because Chinese tend to use language prescriptively rather than descriptively. Max Weber and others convinced people in the West to get rid of value-laden words and become wertfrei, as he said. So it's easy for there to be misunderstandings.
Yes, I can imagine. But what did you sort of take away from that experience?
Well, I had a close encounter, of course, with the Nixon entourage from the White House. He was a very peculiar man indeed, as his failure ultimately, which was a failure of character and management ability rather than anything else, demonstrated. He was also quite a brilliant statesman. He had early on seen the imperative of ensuring the continued existence of China as a player on the geopolitical chessboard when it was threatened by the Soviet Union, as it was. And his purpose in going to China was twofold. First, to enlist China in the containment of the Soviet Union, if he could, but at least to offer help to China to ensure it could stand up to the Soviet pressure it was under. And second, of course, forlornly, as it turned out, to persuade the Chinese to lean on Hanoi, North Vietnam, to end the war in Vietnam, which of course failed totally. So it was a mixed picture. What no one anticipated was that we were setting in motion a process by which opening China to the world would fundamentally change China and ultimately the world. We now confront a China which is a challenge primarily because it's more successful at capitalism under communist rule than we are.
Indeed. It's a lot of the arguments happening now with China and TikTok and all these other stuff. But I mean, thinking back to that time, I mean, obviously you've worked with Nixon quite closely, I'd imagine, or during that conference. What was it actually like to be with Nixon? What was he like on a personal level to deal with?
He had very little small talk. He was a very serious man. He was a gifted advocate. If he were in the UK, he would have been a barrister, not a solicitor. He bored Joe and I to such an extent that Joe and I started talking to me. I'm equally boring, but evidently, but I was a good deal younger. I was only 27, 28 years old. And my first act in Beijing was to refuse to interpret for Nixon because he lied to me. He basically, I was told that I was to interpret his banquet toast, which is in these operatic performances. This is the major policy statement for a visit. And I said I'd be happy to do that. Might I see the text? And I was told there is no text. He's going to do this extemporaneously. And I ended up saying to his staffer who told me that, you know, it might interest you to know that I drafted the toast for tonight, and I know there is a text. And if you don't give it to me, I am not doing this. This Chinese is not French or Spanish. It's quite different. And I need to know what poetry, because I've heard there's been poetry from Chairman Mao put in this toast. And if you think I'm going to get up in front of the entire Chinese Central Committee and the world and ad-lib Chairman Mao's poetry from an unknown English translation back into Chinese, you're out of your cotton-picking mind. I'm not doing it. So at that point, he pulled the text out of his pocket and gave it to the Chinese, who then came to me and said, "What is this poetry?" And we jointly found it, and everything went well. Would have been a disaster if I'd gotten up there.
Well, but did you, I mean, you've obviously spoken to the then Chinese leader. Did you also meet Mao while you were there? Or?
No, Nixon, one of his peculiarities was paranoia. And he thought that people who might have contact with the press, or maybe even a think tank person or so, like you know, might inadvertently reveal things that should be kept hidden. So he took nobody from the State Department to his meeting with Chairman Mao. There was no Chinese speaker present. And we have a transcript, but we don't know whether this was Mao speaking or his interpreter ad-libbing various wise remarks.
Oh, that's quite interesting. His paranoia followed him even into diplomacy.
Well, it was ubiquitous. No, I would say finally, to his credit, about 2 days after I'd refused to interpret for him, he called me over and with tears in his eyes apologized, said I shouldn't have done that. It was the wrong thing. He had almost a photographic memory, and he had planned to recite the toast without having a piece of paper in front of it. He was afraid that I would turn up there with the text and steal his performance from him. He didn't realize that not only had I written the text, but I remembered it. I could have done it without the text. It's just the poetry that bothered me.
Was it that bad?
Chairman Mao was a very good poet in the classical Chinese style. And I think he will be remembered not for his political contribution to the new China. He's rather like Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, who united China, but then was succeeded by the Han Dynasty, which really created the lasting Chinese political culture. Deng Xiaoping in 1981, when I arrived as chargé d'affaires in Beijing and saw him, told me he thought the real revolution had begun under his rule at the end of 1978, when he pushed China toward opening and reform and sought to use the United States as a means of de-Maoifying China. So Anyway, we had no idea that we were changing China, or for that matter, our own country. It was a political gamble. Nixon did not know whether this would be well or poorly received in the United States. As it turned out, it was a public relations triumph, which helped him get re-election amidst the Watergate scandal.
It's often been said, when especially in regards to China, there was a lot of you've seen all the analysis on it, that initially a lot of people think this was a largely Kissinger's move towards opening with China, whereas others say no, in fact this was Nixon's thing, and that Nixon was actually quite for all his faults, quite a switched on foreign policy thinker, which not every US president can be accused of. What was your sort of sense of all of that?
Well, no, it's very clear that it was Nixon's initiative. In fact, when Nixon first broached the idea of an opening to China to Dr. Kissinger, Kissinger came out of the Oval Office and told his deputy he thought the president had gone nuts. As it happened, when Kissinger encountered the Chinese, he discovered kindred spirits. That is, people who thought geopolitically, were practitioners of realpolitik, totally unsentimental, and extremely well informed, despite China's isolation, about every corner of the world. So the Chinese even then thought like a world power, even though they were barely a regional power, quite the opposite of the peevish Europeans that Kissinger had to deal with, who had once thought globally, but having lost their empires, were suffocating themselves with discussions of what the new European man would look like and other things that would drive most people to stick their head in the oven and turn on the gas.
Indeed, indeed. And obviously, as time went on, you sort of rose through the ranks, as it were, and you ended up in Saudi Arabia around the time of the first Gulf War in 1990 to 1991. How did you how did you come to be the ambassador to Saudi Arabia?
Well, nothing could have been farther from my intentions. I was in the midst of trying to produce a Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola and a South African withdrawal from Namibia to give it independence, and trying to break the East German and Cuban hammerlock on some of the Southern African Portuguese colonies. I was in Maputo, Mozambique, and I got a call asking me if I would be George H.W. Bush's personal representative and U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And I had transited Saudi Arabia in the middle of the night, and never had any desire to set foot in it, frankly. And so one is supposed to be enthusiastic when offered something like this. President Bush assured me nothing ever happened in Saudi Arabia, so this was going to be a very uneventful tour. And I arrived, of course, in time for the Gulf War, the war to liberate Kuwait from 1990 to 91. In some senses, it was the ambassadorship of the century. I taught myself enough Arabic to understand the king. I wasn't, by then I was in my mid-late 40s, and I was quite confident I could not get up and give a speech in Arabic. But I did learn to understand the king, and for a year and a half, he didn't realize I understood him when he was talking to his advisors, saying, "What should I tell this clown?" And but then one day he asked me a question. I mistakenly replied directly in Arabic, which blew my cover. So I came to be very fond of many, many people in Saudi Arabia. But from the point of view of any Westerner, at that time, it was a very difficult society to live in, especially given the status of women, gender apartheid, and the isolation of the kingdom. It was easier to go to Tibet in those days than to get a visa to Saudi Arabia, unless you were making Hajj or Umrah. And even then, there were restrictions. So it was a great education. It left me with many fond memories of people and big bags under my eyes from 7 months of warfare.
So when you actually arrived, and when did the invasion of Kuwait happened on the 2nd of August 1990. When did you sort of arrive in Saudi? Was it around that time or was it before?
No, it was a year, almost a year before.
A year before.
I was held hostage by Jesse Helms, the late and, in my view, unlamented right-wing senator from North Carolina, who told me it was nothing personal. But anyway, oddly enough, Jonas Savimbi, who was the opposition to the government in Luanda and Angola, aided by us and by the South Africans as part of the bargaining process over the Namibian independence, Angolan troop withdrawal issues, called Jesse Helms and said, why are you holding up this wonderful fellow? And because I used to go see him and take him a tin trunk full of books. He read 4 hours every day, wherever he was. And he was a polyglot. He was perfectly comfortable in English, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Kiyovimbundu, Ombundu, and Kimbundu, and Lingala, and a bunch of other languages, French, yes, as well. And quite a brilliant, somewhat crazy fellow. He had cerebral malaria, and one of the reasons I took him to books was that many people had gone in to see him and not come out alive. So I thought, well, the least I can do is tend to his intellectual needs, and then perhaps he won't strangle me.
Indeed, indeed. So you were there and you made it a year before. What was the sort of attitude of the Saudi government at the time to the Gulf crisis? Because from what I understand from various readings, before the sort of 2nd of August, the feeling was, from what I can tell from different Arab capitals, and they were advising Bush this as well, that Saddam was not being serious about an invasion of Kuwait, and that this wouldn't happen. And so what was it like during this period in the build-up towards it? What were they telling you?
Of course, Saddam was threatening the United Arab Emirates as well as Kuwait on the same grounds, namely alleged cheating on OPEC quotas, as well as other differences. And the only country in the Gulf that took him seriously was, in fact, Sheikh Zayed's UAE. And he argued for a joint US-UAE air exercise called Ivory Justice, which would test interoperability in the event that that was required as a response to an invasion by Saddam. Saudi Arabia was adamantly opposed to this. They thought it was provocative to Saddam. They did not take him seriously. And nor did Kuwait, frankly. And Kuwait and Iraq began a series of discussions under Saudi auspices in Jeddah, which turned out to be a deception. There was a basketball game between the basketball team of the Iraqi Republican Guard and the Kuwaitis, and that turned out to be special forces who guided in a helicopter assault. So this was a brilliant deception by Saddam. In retrospect, we could see that on July 20, he had exercised this invasion, but it had not been seen for what it was. It was known, but it was not seen for what it was. He had also established a collusive relationship both with King Hussein in Jordan and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. So the three of them were in on the plot, as it were. But the Saudis were taken totally by surprise when he not only, some people had thought perhaps he would occupy the oil fields in the north of Kuwait and hold Kuwait for ransom, because the Kuwaitis had foolishly, in my view, asked for the repayment of the $13 billion in loans they had made to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. The Saudis had loaned $28 billion, but they were clever enough not to ask for it. Anyway, instead of doing what people thought he might do, he occupied all of Kuwait and proceeded to try to annex it. This on August 6th, when I had just left Saudi Arabia for home leave. I flew back with Dick Cheney, then the Secretary of Defense. And when we arrived in Jeddah to meet King Fahd, we had with us photographic evidence that Iraqi Special Forces reconnaissance patrols were 15 to 25 kilometers inside Saudi Arabia, marking out invasion routes, one toward Riyadh and one along the coast of the Mantiq al-Sharqiyya, the eastern province, in the general direction of the UAE. And I suppose Qatar as well, because it's in the way. So there was no doubt in anybody's mind at that point what was going on. But nobody had really foreseen it, except, I might say, two people, myself and the American ambassador to Baghdad, the much maligned April Glaspie. The two of us sought instructions from Washington on the basis that we thought Saddam was going to do something to Kuwait. We didn't anticipate annexation, but we thought he was going to attempt to rob the bank in Kuwait, as it were. And we were laughed out of court and denied a hearing, and yet we turned out to be right. Everybody else rather laughed at us. Poor April Glaspie was accused, having no instructions. Ambassadors cannot declare war without instructions. She was thrown to the sharks by those authorities in Washington who had decided not to pay any attention to her.
Wasn't it also the case, because this is something I was reading recently, because as you might be aware, there's a new book out about Saddam and this time period, the name of the author's gone out of my head, but it's called the Achilles Hill. And in there, he's sort of saying, well, the problem with specifically the meeting between Gillespie and Saddam is that the transcript for that, if I understood him correctly, this came out after it went through the White House. And there was an interest in the White House to project this as this is not a mistake we made, this is a mistake she made.
Yeah, well, I can't speak to that, but I do know that she was left without instructions despite several attempts to get them. And in the absence of instructions, what was she to do? She had no reason to believe she would be called to see Saddam. This was something he initiated. And she was unprepared, not by her own fault. Yes, this was a cover your ass operation in the White House.
And so when you went to the Saudis with all this information, and obviously this is now after the invasion, did you notice a very immediate change in the way Saudi Arabia was sort of dealing with the issue and how they thought about the issue?
Well, King Fahd, in the meeting, after receiving a briefing on Operation Desert Shield, which involved the deployment of 220,000 American troops to the kingdom to defend it against the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, which were poised for an invasion, took this seriously and said, come. At which point, Crown Prince Abdullah intervened, and he said, in accordance with the tradition of Shura in Islam and the system of government in the Arabian Peninsula, which is basically derived from tribal models in which the sheikh, or the emir, if you will, is meant to proclaim a consensus, not to make decisions. He's also meant to distribute alms, charity, to the poor and ensure that the needy are taken care of. Now, those are basically two responsibilities. Abdullah said, you can't do this to his brother. You must consult with the family, with the merchants, and with others in the kingdom before you commit us to such a momentous decision. And Fahd's response was, look, if we don't act, if I don't make a decision, we will end up like Kuwait. There is no Kuwait. To which Abdullah replied, well, yes, there is a Kuwait. And Fahd said yes. And its territory consists of hotel rooms in London and Cairo. And we do not want to end up like that. And Abdullah withdrew his objections. And Fahd later told me this was the only time in 5 decades of public life that he had ever made a decision rather than ratified a consensus. So it was an interesting moment.
Yes, certainly. It sounds like a very interesting moment. And then, of course, they were on board with the coalition, and they actually, US troops did go to Saudi and launch strikes against Iraqi troops in Kuwait from there. So, I mean, a lot of very interesting things happened. What did, though, this sort of your time in Saudi Arabia teach you about the Saudi view on foreign policy?
Well, Saudi Arabia at that time was a strange mixture of first and third world elements. I remember someone joining my embassy transferred from Moscow, and I asked him, what's the difference between Moscow and Riyadh? And he said, Moscow is a third world city inhabited by first world people, and Saudi Arabia is the opposite. What I mean by this is there are some institutions, Saudi Aramco, which was formed by American oil companies and which is very modern in its management and totally Saudi now, of course, including expatriate labor, but Saudis are all in charge. And it's a very efficient and effective corporate structure. The Ministry of Finance, which had been aided by the US Treasury, and the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, SAMA, were equally professional. The foreign ministry had the most beautiful building that any foreign ministry in the world has, but there was nothing in there but the sort of personal entourage of the very gifted Saudi foreign minister, Saud al-Faisal. So what you had was no institutions for the most part. You had personal entourages running things. I think that's sort of the definition of the third world in my mind. If you develop institutions for better or ill, then you have a structure that survives personality changes. Saudi Arabia had not done that in many fields at that time. I think it's come a long way, but it was interesting. Going back to the question of how decisions were made, on Monday afternoons, there was the Council of Ministers meeting, chaired by the king as the prime minister. And now the prime minister is the crown prince. And at these meetings, the king would put forward a proposition, a proposal, and ask for a debate, which would occur. And when the debate was done, he would collect votes in the form of little chits from each of the ministers present. And if there was no absolute majority, he would remand the issue for further discussion. He would not decide. He would not cast the deciding vote, as it were. So this was a place in which, as I said, the national motto should have been progress without change. You could only see that change had occurred in the rearview mirror. You never saw it as it happened because it was happening with glacial speed. And it was happening through indirection more than direction. And there was a great deal of deference to public opinion. The king, at that time, the Majlis, the open council meetings that every member of the royal family is meant to hold, or ministers in the government, was a sounding board for policy issues as well as personal peeves and law cases and the like. And the royal family was very much aware of what had happened to the Shah of Iran, not paying attention to the sentiment of his people adequately. And they were excessively deferential to the religious establishment as a result. So it was a very interesting place with its own interesting politics. Not at all, the king there is not Henry VIII. He might have an equal number of wives, but he didn't have any other similarity. He was a president. He presided. He did not decide for the most part. Now, you could even see later, I had a conversation with by then the regent, as Fahd had a stroke, and Abdullah had basically taken power. I had a discussion with him about the disconnect between government revenue and the Saudi economy. And I said to him, if I were to go to Nevada, let's say in the United States, and either with my own money, which I don't have, or banks' money, develop an industrial estate and a related community, a new city, if you will, and I would not ask the government to do anything. The government wouldn't have to spend any money at my request, but it would still have to provide police, education, water treatment, highway maintenance, and so on after the community came into being. And the same thing is true here, except more so, because you also provide basically free water and electricity and so forth. So if somebody develops something in Saudi Arabia, your revenues don't grow because you don't have any taxes, but your expenditures grow. So the more you develop, the less you can afford it. And you're headed for a crisis. And you need to have a tax system. You need to, and he said, I agree with you. I have worked with the Ministry of Finance to try to develop a tax system. I had meetings with the family, they agreed. I had meetings with various people from the Eastern Province, they agreed. I had meetings with the merchant princes of the Western Province, the Hijaz, and I said to them, of course, if we're taxing you, you must have a role in the decisions about how the revenues are spent. So I'll give you a Majlis al-Shura. You'll have a parliament. Would all here who are willing to pay taxes for the privilege of being represented in parliament, please raise your hands. He said no one raised their hand. There's an old Arabian adage, he said, no representation without taxation. Quite the opposite of the American principle, I suppose. And he said, of course, they feared waste, fraud, mismanagement, and that the royal family would pilfer the funds. So he said, I couldn't do it. So this was not the dictatorial system that it was vilified as being.
Yes, it's a very complex country in how it runs, and even now, it's obviously a lot has changed in Saudi Arabia in the last 30 years, but it's still a very complex place in a complex system, which I think few outsiders truly comprehend or understand. Both because it's not like there's particularly one book you can particularly read that will tell you how it runs, but also
that is actually something remarkable because I read a lot. And everywhere I have gone, I have read everything I could lay my hands on, sometimes thousands of books about that place and its culture and so on. I found very little relevant on Africa at that time. I think there's a great deal more now, but there wasn't much about African history, culture, and so forth. It tended to be about the European colonization of Africa. Remarkably, I found almost nothing worthwhile about Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that there were 4,000 PhD dissertations by Saudis sitting in American repositories, many of them writing about Saudi Arabia. These had not been turned into books. Saudis don't like to hear nasty things about themselves. And if you're at all critical, you don't get published. So the only things I found that were insightful, really, were some studies by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which, however, they're very sound scholarly works and very interesting, but they lacked what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl. They didn't have their hand on the pulse. They didn't have the insight that comes from interacting with people, watching their body language and how they react to different things. So they were very academic, sound, but academic. So you're right, it's very little. And then, of course, after 9/11, there was a flood of polemical literature about Saudi Arabia, most of it not worth the paper it was written on.
Hmm. Yes, and after 9/11 brings us nicely to your future career developments, which you ended up on the National Intelligence Committee? What was the name?
No, I was not.
You got opposed.
I was
for it. Appointed.
I was vigorously opposed by the Israel lobby,
which brings us nice to our topic today.
And because I had been critical of Israel for many of the reasons that are now exemplified by its behavior in Gaza. That is the dehumanization of the Palestinians and the slow genocidal expulsion of them from their lands, and a foreign policy which is almost entirely military rather than, I mean, people, even Israelis, would tell me that the idea of Israeli diplomacy is an oxymoron. You can't have such a thing. We carry guns. We don't do things with words. Of course, they do things with words, and that was another thing. I rather called them out on Hasbara, the propaganda machine that they have, which is very effective. I mean, I admire it as a former practitioner of propaganda. It's a beautiful model, but it is very deceptive. So having had the temerity to speak out, I should say, you know, after my initial experience with Israel, which left me shocked at its racism, which was the most extreme I'd ever seen, although I'd been in the American South before and during the Civil Rights Movement. Such condescension toward the Arab population I could never have imagined. I had the temerity to speak out publicly after my retirement from government service, when I was free to do so. And of course, this wasn't appreciated. And I was accused of being a realist and lacking sufficient sentimental attachment to Israel. Well, that was probably correct. And I'm very happy that I didn't actually get to do the position as chair of the National Intelligence Council, because I'm quite aware that in the first meeting that President Obama had about Afghanistan, when he asked the attendees, does anybody here think we should withdraw? I would have raised my hand and said, yes, when we accomplish the mission. By the way, what is our mission? What are we trying to do? To which, of course, there never was an answer because we kept moving the goalposts, and it wasn't clear whether it was all about women's education or, you know, something else. But in the end, it all collapsed, as I rather feared it might.
Indeed, indeed. And so that's sort of what happened there. So let's now move to your assessment on what's been happening. I mean, obviously, since October 7th, obviously, we've seen this, you know, as I said in the intro, you know, you have lots of Israeli hostages that are taken by Hamas or in Gaza, an Israeli government which has, you know, partly said it wants the hostages back, but has done actions which arguably, well, not that arguably, we can see it empirically, haven't really returned very many of them. The only time they ever really got large numbers was through negotiations, of course. And the fact is that the US has, you know, is supporting the Israel in this action. So how would you assess US foreign policy towards the conflict since October 7th?
Well, there's a dilemma, of course, because US policy toward Israel has always been an extension of domestic politics. That was why President Truman extended recognition to the newly established state of Israel, despite its violation of the UN partition plan and its expulsion of the Palestinian population in what they call the Nakba. This is still the case. President Biden is running for office, re-election. He's dependent on donations from Jewish plutocrats, and not much, I think, in his case, from Christian evangelicals who are more inclined to support Mr. Trump. But he couldn't run his campaign if he were to cross Israel. reactions would be very strong. And the Congress, which is very much, as someone once said, Israeli occupied territory, would react badly as well, which would mean that his domestic program would run afoul of further opposition than it already has. So that's one set of considerations. The other is the moral authority of the United States and our self-image, which are in conflict with the genocidal actions of Israel. To date, the president has basically retreated slowly away from Israel, but not taken the decisive steps that he should have taken to prevent the genocide and halt the horrors that we now see in not just Gaza, but also in the West Bank, with the settlers engaged in violent pogroms against the Palestinian residents. So the policy is self-contradictory. It has virtually no support outside a few places in Europe, including where you are at present, to your disgrace, I should say. I mean, it's not a disgrace that you're there, but the policies of the government are disgraceful in this regard. I've always been a practitioner of realpolitik, but there are moments, and this is one of them, when principles and morality must override those considerations. And I think the policy has been an utter failure. And I'll conclude by saying that on the Israeli side, the hostage issue is a very powerful political force against the Netanyahu government and his fascist colleagues in it, who don't give a fig about the hostages, apparently, and are instead intent on carrying out what can only be described as a psychotic policy of exterminating the Palestinians or expelling them. I think they probably prefer to expel them, but if they can't, they'll kill them, either by starving them or by bombing them or by sniping at them, as we have seen. And this goes on. And to date, the American response, as I said, has been one of steady retreat away from Israel, or apparent retreat. This so-called temporary pier that is to be put into Gaza to supplement performatory diplomacy in the form of airdrops is a farce. First of all, it's not going to be there for several months, by which time most of the people it was intended to help will be dead of starvation. Second, it is in effect a reinforcement of the Israeli siege of Gaza. Everything that goes through that pier will be inspected by the Israelis. The United States says there will be no troops on the ground in Gaza. Certainly, Israel is not going to allow Hamas to return to distribute the food. So the implication is that Israeli troops are going to be on the ground. And the United States apparently is colluding with this. And it's doing it despite mass murder and slaughter and a cruelty that the world has not seen in this century being perpetrated on Palestinians in Gaza. So I would say the American policy is deferential to Israel to a degree that is disgusting to many Americans. It may cost President Biden the election because there is a surge in the United States, as there is in the UK, of opposition to this excessively subservient policy toward Mr. Netanyahu and his fellow fascists.
Yes, and it's interesting because you do sort of, when you sort of sit here and watching this, you do sort of wonder, what long-term strategy thinking is going on in the US government, because effectively, America's strongly identified by what Israel is doing, and it's going to hurt all sorts of diplomacy and issues across the region, right? And the fact is, the US didn't necessarily want this war to happen. It happened. and it's now got a new crisis that it probably didn't want to be dealing with because it's still got Ukraine, it's got other crises to look at, stand up for China. Now they're being dragged back into the Middle East, but they're being dragged in a way that's, as you said, completely acquiescent to Israel, which is going to hurt all sorts of other things they want to do.
Well, the strategic costs are enormous, and they come on top of the essential divorce between the West and the rest of the world over the Ukraine issue, which is seen globally as a squabble among Europeans from which other non-Europeans should properly remain distant, the exception being Japan, which is part of the G7, meaning the club of former imperial powers. So that separation was already there. It's not a formal divorce, I suppose. It's a separation. But the Gaza issue coming on top of that has cost the United States the moral argument everywhere. It has cost Israel so heavily that it will only find out when this is over. In many parts of the world, when people look at the Star of David, which was once a symbol of the victimization of Jews by Europeans, they now see something resembling the Nazi swastika, a symbol of the perpetrator of genocide. This is fundamentally injurious to Israel, but it's also terribly injurious to non-Israeli Jews. My country has the largest Jewish population in the world. Many of the younger people in those communities, I should say communities plural because they don't agree about very much, except for the most part they have agreed about Israel. Those agreements about Israel have been broken. There is now a wave of dissonance, and it's reflected at the ballot box in uncommitted votes in Democratic primaries, which have not just been in Michigan, but many places. It's not just Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, but increasingly African Americans and progressive Americans of one sort or another who are disgusted by our government's continued allegiance to an Israeli government that is guilty of genocide. So the strategic costs in terms of soft power, or I would say more properly diplomatic capabilities, are going to be immense. This is isolating not just Israel, but the United States, and to some extent also the UK, I believe.
Yes, and just sort of to go back onto this, I mean, we've talked about the strategic cost, but in your view, is there any real strategic benefit for the United States to be as close to Israel as it's been currently?
It's very hard to make the argument that there is. I mean, the reason for the American cuddling up with Israel historically has been, first, that we share values. But I certainly don't share the values that are now on display. Some Americans, probably members of the Ku Klux Klan, may share those values, but they're nothing that any American would be proud of. So the values argument, the ideological argument, doesn't work. Israel is not a secular state, which we proudly are, or have been. Maybe we're becoming not secular, which is a shame. But that value also does not exist. Israelis can't even agree on who is a Jew, which is remarkable. So the values argument has gone completely. The strategic argument that Israel is somehow helpful to the United States is belied by the fact that it continually gets us into wars, starting with the Suez Crisis in the mid-50s, which your country had the misfortune to take a role in, and continuing through multiple confrontations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War over various wars. 1967, it was Israel that conducted a surprise attack on Egypt and Syria, not the opposite. And it was Israel that took and illegally annexed territory, not the Arabs. 1973, the Ramadan or Yom Kippur War, if you will, began with an Egyptian surprise counterattack to retake the Sinai from the Israelis. It didn't end well for Egypt, but in the end, Sadat made his point, and this paved the way for the Camp David Accords. Those accords are now, by the way, in jeopardy. The Egyptian government is sending signals, one doesn't know whether they're serious or not, that if there is an Israeli operation in Rafah, then it may withdraw from the Camp David framework. Egypt has a history of flipping sides in different geopolitical contests, but this would be a major development of tremendous detriment to Israel. And now I think Israel is costing the United States, as I said, virtually all our remaining moral authority globally. I mean, here we are in the UN voting on one occasion with Nauru, the only other, you know where that is? Very few
Pacific
people
Island.
do. That's putting it politely, yes. It's a sort of little blip of guano in the middle of nowhere. It's a most unfortunate country, and it is the closest thing I have to say to a diplomatic prostitute that I've yet encountered. Pay them enough and they'll do anything. And so, we are totally isolated in the General Assembly on this issue. We're totally isolated in the Security Council. Your own country has abstained rather than supported us. Everyone else has voted against us. So the degree of our isolation ought to be apparent. Unfortunately, the American media, for the most part, do not report anything that is adverse with relation to Israel. So we don't learn much about what is actually happening. Social media, TikTok, for example, has been a major source of information for young people on the horrors in Gaza. That is one reason that it's being taken down in the United States. Because if the former Treasury Secretary, who is a Zionist, buys it, you can bet that it's not going to continue the coverage of Gaza that it has done. So there's more to this than just the anti-China neurosis that we suffer from.
Indeed. And so sort of my last question to sort of finish up on, what do you think is going to be the end, of the end goal for this Israeli operation in Gaza? And what do you see as sort of being the future consequence for the region as a result of that?
Well, we're in serious jeopardy of seeing an operation conducted against Hezbollah in the north. And the reason for that is similar to the hostage issue in Israel. It's domestic pressure on the government to appear tough and to accomplish something. In this case, the northern part of Israel has been evacuated or people have fled because of fear of Hezbollah rockets. And they are demanding military action. And we hear from the Israeli military warnings that that might happen. That would certainly spread the war more than it has. It has already proliferated horizontally with the involvement of the Houthi government in Yemen, which we don't recognize, but which is still the effective authority in Sana'a, in support of an end to the genocide with carefully targeted operations, misleadingly labeled as indiscriminate by your government and mine, but against shipping in the Red Sea that is connected to Israel, either carrying cargo to or from Israel, or in the case of the United States Navy and the British Navy, Royal Navy, supporting the ships that do that, and thereby supporting the continuation of the genocide. So, and we have seen various resistance groups, despite, I think, cautionary advice from Iran, which backs them, taking action against U.S. forces in the region. So there's already been some horizontal proliferation of the war, and it could get much wider. But more importantly, there is no prospect that Israel can exterminate Hamas or something very like it as the flag carrier of Palestinian nationalism. Quite the contrary. What Israel is doing is multiplying the ranks of fanatic opponents of Israel and ensuring that there will be further attacks on Israelis, and I dare say the backers of Israelis, who include people like me. I'm an American. I'm not in sympathy with what Israel is doing, but I doubt that a Palestinian who has been sufficiently aggrieved would make that discrimination. So I think we may see a return to the sort of terrorism, if you will, that characterized the mid-60s, when the Palestinians felt they had no other avenue by which to pursue self-determination, unless Israel goes through a collapse, which is not impossible. 500, 600,000 Israelis have emigrated. Many of them, a good many of them, most of them perhaps, have bolt holes arranged. They've got second country passports. They have safe havens prepared. They don't have confidence in their country. Even before all this happened, Israel was in crisis over the Netanyahu effort to stay in power by suborning the judiciary and reducing its independence. And so they're not in sympathy with the settlers who now run the government in Israel, some of them. The people who have left are by and large very good people. If they have come to Britain, that's your gain, not an Israel's loss. And if they've come here, it's the same for us. They are people of conscience, and they are people who are sufficiently attuned to reality that they're reacting intelligently by separating themselves from what may be a foundering ship. So I would say the future is uncertain, but it does not look good for Israelis or Americans or Brits, for that matter.
Chas Freeman, thank you for talking to us at Memo Conversations.
My pleasure.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to catch up with this one or watch previous Memo Conversations, you can go to our website. Until next week, please do tune in next week for more Memo Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.